In barely a month and a half, Ontario voters get a chance to elect municipal governments of all shapes and sizes across this province. Are they tuned in yet? When we have such questions, we like to turn to the artificial intelligence pollster known as Polly for answers. And that means we're joined on the line from the nation's capital by Erin Kelly, the CEO of Advanced Symbolics, Inc. And it sure feels like I was just talking to you a few months ago about provincial politics, Erin, and now here we go on local politics. How you doing?
Great. How are you?
Excellent, thanks. Well, they say that the campaigns don't really begin in earnest until after Labor Day, and that's where we are now. So, how much engagement, now that we're after Labor Day, are you seeing, or more accurately, is Polly seeing right now?
Well, I was actually quite amazed. I went back 3 months, so I looked over the summer holidays because usually people, when they're at the cottage, they don't like to talk politics. I was actually quite surprised, especially after what we saw with the provincial election with the low engagement, that there's actually quite high engagement across municipalities and people are really excited about these elections.
Any municipalities in particular that stand out?
Yes. Now, so the municipalities where we are seeing a lot of incumbents who are retiring or not running again, um, those are the municipalities where people are engaging the most. They're both very excited, and in some cases, we're seeing high concern.
Want to name names?
Well, the one that really stands out for me is Sault Ste. Marie. So in Sault Ste. Marie, there's a lot of people talking about the election, but there's also in Sault Ste. Marie and in Brantford, there are people saying that they're concerned because of the lack of competition. Because in a lot of municipalities, the incumbents are leaving, but they don't have a lot of people putting up their hand to take their place. That people are concerned that the people who are running have an agenda. So in some cases, and I'm not going to say which municipalities because I mean, this is the realm of opinion, not fact, but some of them are saying, I know this person, he has very controversial views. I'm seeing in some posts, this person is a member of the Proud Boys, this person was part of the convoy, and that they're coming in and they're now running for office. So there are some concerns in some municipalities. And then you've got the regular NIMBY concerns, people who are too pro-development or too anti-development. So those are things we normally see. But in Sault Ste. Marie, we're definitely seeing a lot of talk about the candidates themselves and in Brantford about whether or not there are underlying agendas there.
Well, I know they've got good mayor's race happening in Sault Ste. Marie, maybe not quite as good as Hamilton, which has probably got the best mayor's race in the whole province. But it's often the case, Erin, that sometimes the right wing of the political spectrum gets very energized in the lead up. Other times it's the left wing that gets very energized in the lead up to a municipal election. Can you tell which it is this time?
Yeah, we can definitely see that. And, there's too many municipalities to go through. We definitely see, like in Toronto and in some urban areas, it's a very left-leaning agenda. And in other municipalities, I think Thunder Bay is coming to mind, there are more right-wing ideology. And Polly is able to distinguish those things.
Incumbent mayor in Thunder Bay also not running for re-election, which is a bit of a theme, I would have to say, this time. There are a lot of cases in a lot of different councils across the province, 444 municipalities, where a lot of incumbents are not standing again. I mean, almost a third of Toronto City Council is not seeking re-election. I mentioned the mayor in Thunder Bay, the mayor of Hamilton not running for re-election, the mayor of Ottawa not running for re-election, exactly, in your town. How do people feel about the fact that it seems that so many incumbents are declining to stand again?
Overall, people are really excited about it. People are excited about the possibility for change. So if I were to describe throughout the province, that's the overall feeling is anticipation, excitement. There are some municipalities, obviously, where they really liked their incumbent mayor and councillors. Not to say that the other ones they didn't, but people are excited for change because often in some municipalities, the mayor has been there a long time. In a place like Ottawa, where I'm from, the mayor has not only been there a long time, but he's had a very tough term, right? Between transit problems and the convoy, et cetera. People are definitely ready for a change and looking forward to it. And I think in cases like that, you're going to see some very different councils coming forward. But overall, I would say the mood, and I'm really surprised at how many people were talking municipal politics over the summer. It's very unusual. So I think that's exciting for people who are concerned about the lower engagement that we've had. I think this is really kind of igniting people and we're definitely seeing those conversations, and most of it's positive.
Now, admittedly, this next question sort of asks you for some informed speculation as opposed to telling us what Polly has to say. So I'll understand if you want to punt this a little bit, but just humor me for a second here. You know, when we last talked, it was about provincial politics, and the level of engagement in that election was at an historic low, and we saw that well, more than half the people who were eligible to vote didn't turn out. You're seeing increased engagement right now in municipal elections. Can we infer from that that we're going to see a decent turnout in October?
Usually that's the case. When people are engaged and they're excited, they do tend to show up and vote. And we're definitely seeing now, the one thing that could dampen that is where in municipalities where there's a lot of acclamations. So we're definitely seeing in those places where people are acclaimed, there's concern about it, there's unhappiness about it. They wanted to see a competition. So in those cases, obviously, not everybody will be acclaimed, but it might bring down the participation rate. But overall, the engagement is much higher than we've seen in the past. So I hope that means more people will turn out to vote, especially when they're concerned about some of the people that are running.
Amen. I think it's usually about 25 to 35% turnout for municipal elections, which, you know, that's getting pretty low. But are there any particular issues that Polly is picking up that seem to be engaging people in particular this time?
The overall theme, I did look for policing and transit and all of those things that usually people are concerned about in municipal elections. Yes, there is that transit definitely in some municipalities. You know, the larger municipalities, definitely an issue. But overall, it's really just change for the sake of change. I mean, that is really what people are talking about. They're talking about the acclamations and how disappointing that is. They want to see more people running for municipal council, and just the feeling that we will have a change of frame of mind. That's really what's motivating people right now, as opposed to particular issues. Now, as we get closer, now that it's Labor Day, I think maybe we can check in a few weeks from now. We'll probably start to see more of those issues. Right now, it's just, yay, we're going to have change. It's exciting. And that's really what the dialogue is about. Since
Polly spends so much time looking at social media, I guess I should ask a question about the toxicity of social media and whether that is having a dampening effect on people running again. I note in your neck of the woods, there are, I think, 15 municipalities in Eastern Ontario where incumbents are unopposed, or where there's only one candidate for a particular office. I mean, that's a pretty high number. Do you think social media is having a toxic effect on having more people run again?
Social media is definitely a contributor, but what we're actually seeing is councillors are saying if people actually just kept their insults to social media, that wouldn't be as big a problem. But we are seeing councillors are saying people were taking it beyond social media, showing up to their door, threatening them at events when they're walking their dog. So it's really kind of maybe some of this fermented on social media. But a lot of councillors are saying, and politicians generally, like we saw what happened with Chrystia Freeland, it's bleeding outside of social media now to personal encounters. And that's where politicians are saying they're used to the insults, it used to be letters, all of this sort of thing. But now it's bleeding into people showing up, yelling at them on the street, coming to their house. That's where I think it gives people pause. Who would want to run for public office if you're facing that kind of personal threat?
Right. Any surprises that you think are in store for the municipals this October?
I think it's early to say, because so far it's really been people just engaging on the idea of change. And I think we need to spend some more time looking at, in those places where there are races, to see and in those places where people are expressing concern. I think we've mentioned a few municipalities where people are saying, I'm concerned with who is running. I think that will be something to watch for a surprise, but it's early just yet because people aren't actually talking about who they're supporting as much as saying that they're excited about the possibility of change. I think we'll have to check in now that people are back from holiday and they're starting to really look at the issues and think about what they want for their city for the next 4 years.
Right. Let's finish up on the most important question of all, Erin, and that is, by Election Day in October, in that third week of October, who will be higher in the NHL standings overall, the Maple Leafs or the Senators?
The Sens, obviously. I mean, this is our moment. This is our time.
I may need a $5 bet with you on that one, Erin. I think you might not win that one, but we shall see.
I'm optimistic.
Great. If you can't be optimistic in September about your team's chances, you can never be optimistic. So well done. Thanks for joining us on TVO, the first of, I'm sure, many visits over the course of this, our 17th season. Be well.
Great. Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.